You are listening to a True North Eager Beaver media podcast. The True North Eager Beaver podcasts are proudly brought to you by our founding sponsors, the Miss V Mysteries from Corvid Moon Publishing, your source for science fiction, fantasy, and cozy mysteries featuring a broad diversity of characters. CanadianTarot.com, your uniquely Canadian online eclectic tarot community and forum, and the Peppermaster, hot pepper sauces made from fresh farm ingredients to thrill your taste buds and expand your mind. Well, good morning and hello,
Good afternoon.
kids. Or I should say good afternoon. Well, in Alberta, it's still good morning. And
Is it?
hello, kids and cups. Yeah, I think it's 2 hours earlier, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that would make sense, yeah.
So just in under the wire. Uh, welcome to episode 3, technically, of our Alberta pre-election special here at the True North Eager Beaver on the Crier Media Network. We're saying kind of sort of because this one's a little different. On previous shows, we've had more than one guest on at a time, but this time around we haven't been able to coordinate everyone, so this one is maybe going to be a multi-parter. But we have someone today with us that I am personally extremely excited about because I like history. I often use as a hashtag know your history. And, it's important to know where things came from and how things came to be. And our guest is all about history. So I'm pretty excited about that. But today, recording day is Saturday, April 29th, 2023, and it is a rainy day here at the Beaver Lodge. So some final April showers to bring in Mayflowers. I'm your host, the Eager Beaver, pronouns he, him, hey, Mr. Beaver, eh? And with me, as always, is my good pal, Mr. Grizzly. And of course, our thank yous go to our podcast founding sponsors, the Peppermaster, the Miss V Mysteries from Corvid Moon Publishing, and CanadianTarot.com. Mr. Grizzly, how's your mental health today?
I have a migraine, so we'll just leave it at that. Let's roll.
All right. Okay. Our guest today is the creator and writer and host of Canadian History Ehx, a podcast that delves into all things Canadian history, from disasters to pop culture, dark chapters of our history to the weird things that have happened. This man loves Canadian history. He loves bringing it to the masses. If you listen to his podcasts, he's got a whole series of them, different types on different things about history. He makes it accessible. His passion is obvious,
Yes.
which means it's infectious. And I am geeking out because when I was in high school, history was my favorite course. And and of course, when you go through university, you study the history of whatever subject it is that along the way. So I'm fascinated about it. I'm not far from a historian, and our friend Hugh, of course,
Hmm.
my kid Hugh, also a historian. So I'm a big fan of historians and librarians. So, kids, please put your paws together for Mr. Craig Baird. Welcome to the Beaver Lodge.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Oh, so nice to have you here. Thank you. Um, why
How's it?
don't you, well, before we start with anything, Alberta, I mean, what is it about history and what is it about Canadian history that really, because I mean, you've got like, I think 4 different types of shows, I think.
Yeah, 4 or 5 or 6, depending.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love Canadian history. I've always really kind of enjoyed Canadian history. I've always found it to be something that just kind of scratched that itch for me. And then growing up in the 90s when I was in school, I found that, you didn't get a lot of Canadian history in school. Growing up in Alberta, it was very much Western focused. We talked about Louis Riel, but we didn't really talk about Eastern history beyond, say, the War of 1812 and some bits on Confederation. And then when I started seeing things like the Heritage Minutes and then especially Canada People's History, that really kind of sparked
Mm,
a strong interest in Canadian history because it was very accessible and very interesting. It wasn't dry. And it
mm,
showed me that, Canadian history can be very interesting. The problem is we just never really presented it in a way that was interesting. We always focused on like, uh, you know the Confederation and signing
Mhm.
of treaties and things like that. We didn't look at a lot of the really interesting history. So I just kind of, after being a computer programmer and then a journalist, I decided I was just going to start podcasting and sharing Canadian history, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
and you've been at this, what, for a good, you're in season 5 or 6 now?
Yeah, I think I've released over 500 episodes of Canadian History X, and then with From
Wow.
John to Justin, about 150. And then I have Canada, a yearly journey, which kind of looks at each year in Canadian history, Pucks and Cups, which is early hockey history, Canada's Great War, which is the First World War history. And then I did kind of just a 13 episode series called Coast to Coast, which looked at the building of the Transcontinental Railway. So more or less, if I find something I'm interested in, I go completely in on it.
There you go.
Well,
So this
I'm
guy now.
glad that you've pursued your passions because I quite enjoy both your Twitter and your podcast. I didn't know you had
Yeah.
that many episodes, though. Holy crap!
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're as busy as I am.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
He's
Yeah, it
very
is.
prolific. Yes. Um, so what was I'm curious about this because when we started ours, somebody had suggested to me 2 years before I even took a first step to actually start it that I should do it. And I thought that there was absolutely no market
Mhm.
whatsoever. So were you were you confident that there was, or
I I think it was a case of I have kind of the personality where I go, "Oh, I want to do this." And I just jump in. I jump off the diving board without really checking how deep the water is. And that's kind of how I went into podcasting. I was like, you know what? I like Canadian history. I kind of was doing the podcasting just as a side hobby in early
Mhm.
2019. And then I got a bit more serious with it around August of that year where I was like, okay, let's commit to, at the time, 3 episodes a week. And then when the pandemic happened in March 2020, I just decided, okay, you know what? I'm just going to do this as my full time job. I had a decent savings. So I was like, let's just do this. And that's what I've done since. And I mean, at first, yeah, I was only getting, 100 downloads a month. And it is kind of niche in a way because when you look at
Mhm,
podcasting, it's like there's true crime and there's paranormal, which really kind of dominate things. And then since the
Mhm.
pandemic, kind of the genre of celebrities talking about their shows or their lives or whatever it might be kind of
mhm,
popped up. So you have those big genres. So, and history is popular. If you look at like the history of Rome or lore or things like that, or
mhm,
hardcore history, like those are big
Mhm.
shows. So you kind of have the niche of history, and then you have within that the niche of Canadian history.
Mhm.
And if you look at my downloads, I mean, 90% of my downloads are from Canada, because there's very few people in the United States who are like, oh, I want to learn about Canadian history, because,
True.
they just not interested. There are some, like, don't get me
Right.
wrong, but I mean, now that I make a living from it, I think there is enough, but it's all in how you present it. Like, I really enjoy hardcore history, but it's a time commitment. 6-hour episodes. You got to, like, be on a long drive, or like that's you're spending your day listening. So I
Right.
try and make sure my episodes are like 20 minutes. Some would go longer, like Halifax Explosion was an hour, Frederick Banting was an hour. Like, some do go 40 minutes or later. But generally, I like to do 20 to 30 minutes, because, I want people to listen driving to work or something like
Mhm.
that. And
Mhm.
so I think it's just I've worked to try and show people that there is an interesting aspect to history, not just with podcasting, but with, my Twitter. Every morning I get up at 6 and I start going, okay, what happened today? And actually, on my website, I have the transcripts of every episode I've ever written. So that's now a resource for me to search, like, say,
Right.
April 29th, what happened? And I see all my posts where April 29th is mentioned, and then I can draw from that.
Mhm.
And it's about, just saying, here's our history. It's not all boring. It's actually very interesting when you start to look at it. And I think more people are interested in history than they maybe let on, but I think it's a number that's increasing for sure.
Mhm.
One of the things I have to say about that is I found that in high school especially, they made it such a dry subject.
Mhm.
They didn't make it interesting. They didn't teach it in an interesting manner, and they didn't even talk about World War One. It was
Yeah.
never touched on, like never. And I'm
Mhm.
like, are you kidding me? Do you realize how much of a turning point in the history of this Confederation Vimy Ridge was?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I found that, Vimy Ridge was, when they did talk about World War One, it was like, nothing happened. Vimy Ridge happened, then nothing
Yeah.
happened, then the war ended. And it's like, well, there's a lot in here that happened, like huge, and not even, just to do with battles. Like, the 1917 election was a turning point for Canadian history,
Mhm.
and it influenced politics for the next almost century. But you're right; it was very dry, and it was very kind of weighted in a certain way. When I grew up, I remember my social studies teacher explaining that Louis Riel was insane
Mhm.
and he was a traitor, and I grew up with that. So I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I guess he is. And then I start reading about it. And I'm like, well, hold on,
In
this
that
guy's got
sex.
some good ideas here. Like, he's trying to protect his culture. Like, he isn't all bad. Like, he did make some mistakes, but
Mhm.
he
Mhm.
isn't all bad. And I found that it was very weighted in that way. But there also wasn't a big regard for social studies when I was growing up.
Mhm.
When I was, I forget what grade, probably grade 11, we had our assistant gym teacher teaching social studies as a substitute. And he told the class that Confederation happened from east to west. So it was the Maritimes, and then the last province was BC. And I was like, no, BC
That's
was one of the first. Like,
yeah.
this is
Yeah.
Newfoundland was the last. You're completely
Yeah.
wrong. And I got into a big argument with the guy trying to tell him that you're completely wrong. But there just wasn't a big emphasis on teaching Canadian history. And if they did, Cold War, Vimy Ridge, Confederation, Johnny
Mhm.
MacDonald, and especially in Alberta, the Northwest Resistance
Right.
were the big ones.
Mm.
Well, and they
Wow.
never I don't think they ever broached, like, I mean, what got me interested in Canadian history was talking to my grandfather who fought at Vimy,
Mhm.
and telling me about, Passchendaele and the trenches and the hell he went through. And then I started to read Farley Mowat and Pierre Burton, and one of the most thrilling, books I've ever read, and I've read it several times, is Vimy by Pierre
Mhm.
Burton.
Mhm.
It's a historical document, but it reads like a novel. Like, it's
Mhm.
gripping right from the very first sentence, right from start to finish. And he doesn't sugarcoat anything. It's a warts and all. When we first got to England in World War One, they went there for the adventure. That's how they were recruited.
Mhm.
And they partied hard because
Oh,
Canadian
yeah.
soldiers were paid well. And the
Mhm.
prostitutes loved the Canadians, and the Brits hated the Canadians because all the prostitutes went to the Canadian soldiers who had lots of money and were away from home for the first time in their lives. And so
Mhm.
many of them came from small farm towns, right across the country. So I find it's much more fascinating and interesting than it's ever been taught in school, and I think that's a real shame that they have taken away the aspect of holy crap.
The
There's an American fella I watch on TikTok that talks about how, Canadian soldiers in World War One and World War Two were basically the reason the Geneva Convention exists is because of
Mhm.
Canadian soldiers. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, we were
I didn't
hardcore.
know that.
Like, yeah, I think there was a case of like the Germans used to try and exchange gifts or something like that, or they were trying to do something, and they stopped because of the Canadians, because we were just these bloodthirsty, I guess, warriors. Like, I think
Mhm.
even the term stormtroopers
Yes.
comes from Canadians in the First World War. Like, we were
Yeah.
hardcore. Even the Second World War, we had the third largest navy in the world by the end of the war, and everybody forgets that we had,
Mhm,
because we don't do a good job of saying, hey, we did these things, we did
Mhm.
these battles. We live next to the United States, so Canadians just accept that, oh, well, the United States won the war. And it's like, we did a lot. Like the Commonwealth Air Training Plan,
yeah.
110,000 pilots trained in Canada to fight in the war. That is huge. That is
Massive.
a massive impact. But we just don't celebrate our history. Like, we do know things about our history, and certain things we definitely celebrate, like, say, Terry Fox or Sir
Mhm.
Frederick Banting.
Mhm,
But we don't like to be, the rah rah rah,
It's not in our nature.
go Canada. Exactly. And I think it's because we try and separate ourselves from Americans, because that is definitely how we perceive Americans to be. So we want to be more reserved and be like, oh, well, you don't want to be like that. When in fact, there are some things we should be rah rah rah, and some things
mhm,
we should look at and go, ooh, that was kind of bad. We should not do something like that again. And
Mhm.
that's what with Canadian History X, I look at the good and the bad. I want to show the good, amazing things that have happened in Canada, and also some of the the bad thing, like you mentioned, the warts and all. And Pierre Burton is definitely a big influence on me, because I really enjoy his books. I always pick
Mhm.
them up whenever I can, because they're written in a very accessible way. They're interesting, but
Absolutely.
like you said, they're not sugarcoating. He
Nope.
does delve into dark aspects of our history.
mhm.
And I mean, for somebody who is an erudite intellect, his writing doesn't come across as some sort of elitist snob at all. Like,
Yeah.
it's like you said, they're so approachable that
Mhm.
anybody can pick up a Pierre Burton book and read it, and then you see him in an interview, and you're like, "That's the guy who wrote that." I was
Yeah.
like, yes, Muffy and Biffy and I were at the club the other day, and that's sort
My
of who he was in
my
person.
thing was that thing on 22 Minutes, right? Pierre Berton rolls a
Oh,
joint
man.
or something.
Every birthday, and I think anniversary of his death, I share that, because I
Yeah.
remember the first time I watched that, I was like, "This is hilarious." Like, this is this, like you said, this distinguished person, essentially a national icon, and he's sitting there rolling a joint, talking about, you don't want burns on your bow tie, and I was just like, "This is amazing."
Yeah, I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that.
Now, Craig, one of the reasons I asked you, I've been looking for a pretext to have you on, and because it's Alberta, um, Danielle Smith gave us one. Uh,
Yes.
uh, now, it started with, if I'm understanding this correctly now, Justice Minister David Lametti being at an event or speaking at an event organized. Was it by the AFN? I believe it
I
is.
I think something like that, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, an assembly of the First Nations Special Chiefs Assembly. And he was speaking there, and they started to ask him about resource rights. And because on our national political scene, there's always an issue about, for example, pipelines going off over territory that has not been ceded, or treaty territory, and things that need to be negotiated, and different positions that people take, and then we end up going to court, and then invariably often end up losing.
Mhm.
And then end up having to do the thing that we should have done in the first place, which is just try to be cooperative and not be a bunch of douches, and saying, "Hey, we recognize that we're going to have to go over your land, so hey, can we make a deal here?" Right?
Mhm. Yep.
So, and eventually we get around to doing it for the things that are really, really important. For the things that ultimately weren't really important, though, well, those projects just vaporize. So, it seems that when it comes to address this, and this comes within the context of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that we've signed. So we're trying to bring our laws in correspondence with the overall global principles that are in that agreement, in that declaration. So he's asked about this, and clearly this is a question he seemed to be expecting, because his answer was, I obviously can't pronounce on that right now, but I commit to looking at that. It won't be uncontroversial is the only thing I would say, with a bit of a smile. And when he said that, there was a bit of a chuckle. And of course, being in the media sphere that we are in, well, then the federal conservatives jumped all over that, and all the chuckle, and he's being flippant, and haha, look what he's got planned, ha ha ha, twisting his like mustache. I'm going to tie all the Albertans to the train tracks and let the Indigenous.
Yeah.
So
Snidely, what was Snidely Smith?
Sneed, I think.
Snidely Sneed, yes.
Sneed. Yes. So
I knew it was an SS, and yes, that was a joke in there, if you get it.
And so Daniel Smith was asked about this. And Mr. Grizzly, I have an asset here, and I'm totally stealing this from Nate Pike's show, the Breaking Nate. Sure. he found it already. Just thank you for doing the work for us, Nate. She was prepared for it too. Just want to make sure. Sometimes I listen to things on double speed, so I just want to make sure I'm okay. All right. She was really prepared, and the thing about Daniel Smith is that what we've discovered is that she's very good at talking in a way that just makes everything sound so reasonable if you're really listening to it. And she puts a lot of thoughts and concepts together, and it makes a sentence, and she speaks fast. But if you stop and take each of the clauses of the sentence and put them and analyze them, what? Kind of left with a what. So she has a version of assuming that it is true that David Lametti is going to do this, take over all the resources, why he cannot. And I would like you to then tell us why it is she is wrong.
Absolutely. I can do that.
So First Nations say that the Natural Resource Transfer Agreement violates their treaty rights and is an illegal document that they were never consulted on. So why are you concerned with the federal justice minister saying that he'll look into it if it's something that a First Nation or First Nations are asking him to do?
Well, first of all, the Justice Minister's comments were irresponsible and outrageous. The Natural Resources Transfer Act in 1930 simply gave the Western provinces the same right to develop and control their resources that other provinces in the country already had. It's been enshrined in our Constitution under Section 92 and 92A, and it is outrageous for the federal government to imply that they would take away provincial jurisdiction and provincial rights. We are working in partnership with our First Nations communities to develop resources and look at ways in which we can bring them in as equity partners. We've supported different investments through the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. We continue to encourage businesses to seek an equity partner when Trans Mountain is complete. I know that there's going to be an opportunity for a First Nations consortium to buy into that so that they have a long-term revenue stream. We think that that is the pathway to economic reconciliation, but acting as if we can tear up the Constitution, that was irresponsible. And the Justice Minister should apologize for his comments. The Prime Minister should apologize on behalf of his Justice Minister.
Okay. Of course, the nice little dig at the end, right? That we don't. Not only the Justice Minister should apologize, but the Prime Minister has to come in and says, "Oh, and I apologize too on behalf of the guy who just apologized."
Yeah.
An apology. Now I listen to this, and I listen to this, and it's like, okay, if I do not know the history, well, this sounds legally reasonable. There's a constitution. You can't come and tear it up. And, there's these things. But what I'm hearing is that these resources are ours. And we are going to be magnanimous enough to allow the Indigenous people to come in and have an equity partner. And we are unilaterally determining that that is the best way to achieve economic reconciliation. That's what I hear.
Yeah. I'll begin this with something that happened a few years ago where somebody in the government, I forget who, said that I think something along the lines of pickup trucks are kind of bad for the environment because they release a lot of CO2. Maybe we should just, focus on getting smaller vehicles. And everybody in Alberta lost their minds. There were so many
Mhm.
politicians who were, and I think Jason Kenney even, putting out pictures of them with their pickup trucks talking about how you can't take our pickup truck, and nobody was saying that. And that is something that's very common, especially these days in Alberta politics and even into Saskatchewan politics, where somebody will say something quite minor and it'll be completely inflated in the West. And I was, I'll say that I was born in Calgary. I was raised in Alberta. I grew up on a farm. I learned to drive with a pickup truck, parallel parking between hay bales. So I'm not somebody from like the Salt Spring Islands or from Toronto. Like I've
Mhm.
grown up in Alberta. I
Mm.
as Alberta as you can get. But this province can be very whiny at times and freak out over the smallest things. And this is a good example of that. And now she says, that what he said was they would talk to the Indigenous about resources and everything. And under the agreement that she mentions, Indigenous land is not under the province. That's federal land. So
Mhm.
the province has no say in that. The Indigenous have a say of what resource development. This Jen says 15 cities is a perfect example of this, where somebody says, "Hey, maybe we should plan cities where you can get everything you need within a 15-minute radius," and it becomes they're going to corn you into like a district, and you can't leave it. Like it's
None of that is, yeah,
mind-boggling.
none of that.
It's just a minor suggestion of saying, "Hey, maybe we should try doing this. Might work well for
Simplify
us."
people's lives.
Exactly, it might be a
Yeah.
good thing, and everybody loses their minds. Uh, so yeah, with the Indigenous land, that's federal land. That is not something that the province has a say over. If the federal government and the Indigenous nations want to talk about what to do on reserve land, that's between them. It's nothing to do with Alberta. That's why when people talk about how
Mhm.
Alberta's going to separate, well, if you do, what is your plan with the reserves? That's not your land. That's federal land. What's your plan
Exactly.
with the national parks? That's not your land. You're going to have a bunch of holes in this country of yours that still belong to Canada. And Daniel Smith, I used to live in High River. I was the editor of the paper there when she first ran for. She was the leader of the Wild Rose,
Mhm.
and she was actually very nice. Like she was a very reasonable person. And I don't know what's happened in the past few years, but she seems to really kind of play into that dog whistle politics where you'll take a small thing and really inflate it. And with the National Resources Act, that is a very important part of Alberta history because when we came into Confederation,
Mhm.
unlike, say, BC or Ontario, Quebec, and all the others, we didn't have control over our resources. So for several elections, that was a major promise that each premier would make
Mhm.
that I will try and deal with this and I will try and get it done. And it wasn't until 1930 with John Brownlee where we actually did get that transfer happening and we got control over our resources. And unfortunately, John Brownlee is remembered more for a sex scandal that ended his career than this important legislation, which completely altered the future of Alberta because we discovered oil in Leduc in 1947, which completely changed the history of the province. It turned us
Mhm.
into an extremely rich province. Before that, we were actually a have-not province. We were a poor province. We had a smaller population than Saskatchewan. We did have an oil
Mhm.
strike in Turner Valley, but in terms of comparing Turner Valley to Leduc, it's a drop in the bucket. Uh, so this was a very like looking ahead at what is to
Mhm.
come. So it's a very important thing that happened in our history. But Daniel Smith takes a minor comment and turns it into where they're ripping up the Constitution, which is,
Nuts.
stretch before you make that leap because the amount of distance you just covered is absolutely insane. Where you would go from, hey, let's talk to the Indigenous about resources on their land to it's tyranny. They're going to tear up the Constitution. They're coming in here. They're going to take our resources, when nobody said anything of the like. And it's a very common thing, unfortunately, these days with Alberta and Alberta politics, where you just want to make it seem like the government in the East is so bad. And there can be many reasons for that. One possibly is that Alberta has a lot of, when we were forming, a lot of American immigrants came up here. So it kind of instilled a very individualistic, persona, where out East they're bad and we can take care of ourselves and we can do, what we want when we want. And if they try and do anything, they're trying to take your rights away, which is not the case. And even though we're talking 120 years ago, that mentality is still found in Alberta. There's a reason they call us the Texas of the West, because we have that mentality. And it happens with politics. And sometimes it can be justified. With the National Energy Program, that was actually extremely bad for Alberta. It devastated our economy. But Peter Lougheed was an extremely good premier. And he negotiated with Trudeau, the first one, and got a better agreement. He did, speak to the media, but nothing to the degree of, say, Daniel Smith or Jason Kenney or Pierre Poilievre, where it's inflating something. He was putting out actual facts saying this is very bad for us, and did negotiate to get us a better deal. And with Daniel Smith, by doing stuff like this, people in the East just go, this person's insane. Like, this is who you're electing as your premier. And then the government goes, we're not working with this person because you're taking these huge leaps. And really, no matter what we do, you're either going to take credit for anything that changes, or you're just going to vilify us if things don't change, and you're not really going to meet us halfway. So it's not a good way to manage a province. You got to work with the federal government. They do control certain things, but there's a lot of things they don't control. Healthcare, for example, during the COVID, people freaking over COVID restrictions. Well, that was a lot. That wasn't
all provincial.
Exactly. Other than the border, which again was actually the Americans stopping people from going over.
That's right.
Masks, things like that. Trudeau had nothing to do with that. He did have something to say with like federal things, like say railways, planes, federal institutions, that kind of thing. But going to your corner store, that's your premier. That has nothing to do with the federal government. But
and they drove all the way across Canada to come here and park in my neighborhood.
Exactly.
In Ottawa.
Yeah.
Right. But we want freedom. You just drove across the country, man.
I know. It's so strange. I remember saying when that was happening, I said, I can stand on a street corner and I can smoke a joint next to a cop while watching a gay pride parade. And I can say, this government sucks. I hate this government and I hate Justin Trudeau, and nothing will happen to me.
Nothing.
That's how much freedom I have. The cop can be standing right here and nothing's going to happen. Everything I just did
all of that could be going on at
legal.
Once.
At
That's
once,
freedom
exactly.
everybody has there.
Exactly.
Scenario.
Everybody can do that. And
freedom to be a policeman, freedom to march the pride parade,
Yeah.
freedom to smoke a joint, freedom to not care, freedom to care so much that you join the parade. It's all happening.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let's add to that where in the province of Ontario, women can go topless if they want. There's right.
Yeah.
So you can be standing next to a group of topless women at a pride parade, smoking a joint next to a cop, saying how much you hate the government.
Next to a guy with a placard that says, God doesn't like
he wants to have relations.
Yeah, exactly.
Like this, could all be happening at the same time.
And it's all allowed. I may not agree with what people put up, like you said, if it's anti-LGBTQ or something like that. But hey, they're allowed to do it. They've got the freedom to do it. They're not hurting anybody. I don't agree with the views, but I think of social media as a big part of that, because a lot of politicians are going for those sound bites. And so Daniel Smith saying they're going to rip up the Constitution, that's a soundbite. That's something they can quickly share on social media. And people look at it and go, oh, the government's taken our resources. Yeah. But if you take just a quick second, do a Google search, you can actually see what the person said and go, oh, wait, this is literally nothing to do with me.
Right, exactly.
And move on. See, this is part of their campaign strategy is they get their nanosecond soundbite in there. And because many people across this nation, myself included, work 78 hours a week, and they don't have the time or just so tired they don't want to be sitting there reading all about they just see the soundbite on the news or see it on Twitter or see it online, and that's all they get.
Yeah.
They don't get the background. They don't get the true story. They don't get everything. So they're like, well, that makes sense to me. I'm voting for them, and to hell with that guy in Ottawa. It's like, well, hang on a second here.
Yep.
This is the basis of our program, is to get the information out to people. Let people know they're lying to you, or they're manipulating the message to make it look like somebody said or did something when that was never what occurred whatsoever.
Yep.
And let's not even forget about all the treaty territories out west, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Now I need to, because you got on a roll there, and I made some notes because you said 3 things I want to get into here. Because number one, you can't say sex scandal on this show without telling us what it's about.
Oh,
Number one.
the John Brownlee. Okay, so do you want to do that first?
All right, so let's start with that one.
John Brownlee. So he was the premier of Alberta with the United Farmers of Alberta, who were kind of progressive in a way. They did bring in things like women's suffrage, but also not progressive in ways like eugenics. So that they did kind of push a lot of things with Alberta. Anyway, so John Brownlee was premier from, I believe, 1926 to 1934. And what happened was a family friend, he slept with her and had this ongoing relationship with her. And it got out, and she had told the man she was going to marry. And it turned into this huge thing in the media where there were stories that he was sleeping with her in his son's room, and he told her that, if my wife can't have sex with me, so if you sleep with me, you're literally saving her life, like very manipulative. And she got, I mean, it was the 1930s, so it was very much, a lot of the media was against her. But nonetheless, it completely destroyed his career, because that's essentially what he got associated with, was this sex scandal and cheating on his wife, and sleeping in the back of a Studebaker with this woman. And he actually did have a long career afterwards as a lawyer and such, but anything to do with his premiership always kind of, that's like the period at the end of it. Even though he did say the Natural Resources Act, which was extremely important, nobody really remembers that. They just remember that he was forced to resign as premier because of this massive sex scandal that happened.
Ooh. Thank you. See, Canadian history, kids, it's not boring.
And I will say, I have an episode about him on From John to Justin from earlier this year. So if you want to learn more about all of that, it's there.
All right, there we go. The second thing that you said when you were talking about all that stuff about inflating the issue, right? I'm assuming that there were tons of fundraising emails that went out with that, of course. Just David Lemetti's coming for your, and it just made me think, because it's almost the similar play. It's if you're thinking classical music, it's a variation on the theme of the activist judges when it came to charting the path for the Trans Mountain Pipeline. It's like, you got to do this path. And it's like, no, these activist judges, we're going to go and we're going to challenge it in court, and we're going to fight this, and we're going to challenge it, instead of like just sitting down with the people. I mean, the court even actually laid out a plan, like how you should do this. Yeah. And it's like, so it was like, not only did you do it wrong, but we're going to help you by giving you a paint by numbers so that you can get it done. And instead of doing that, they decided to appeal and challenge and rail about activist judges, and then say, oh, well, I guess it can't happen. But they raised money for about 10 years on that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, the same thing.
Is that the one that Trudeau bought the pipeline?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's going to be finished by like the end of this coming year or something.
Yeah. So like even that, like literally buying the pipeline to help make it happen. But I think it's just, I don't know what it is about Alberta, and Saskatchewan's kind of starting to get to that, that way, kind of to a lesser degree. But I think it's just for some reason Alberta, anything that doesn't go their way, it's a huge thing. They lose their minds over it.
But we're at a point that it's sort of like we had Prime Minister Harper was the most pro-oil prime minister in Canadian history, along with a progressive conservative government in Alberta that was very pro-oil,
Mhm.
and they still couldn't get an inch of pipeline to
Yeah,
Tidewater
yeah.
over an entire decade, even after changing waterways laws and all. They could not get it done. And now Trudeau comes along and says, okay, well, originally planned in 5, but with COVID things got delayed. I'm going to get done in 5 what they didn't get done in 10, and here I'll even buy it. And then it was sort of like, no, not like that, or no, not from him.
Yeah.
We want a pipeline to time, but not if it comes from him. Or not that way.
Well, who was it?
It's like you're going to
Who
get
was
the
it who
damn
recently
pipeline.
proposed? Somebody recently proposed, like, because it was proposed in Alberta. This seems like a great idea. A national energy program.
Yeah. Yeah, somebody
Didn't
didn't
we?
look at the history of that one.
We went down that road before, and when Pierre Trudeau suggested it, you said, "Let the bastards freeze in the east." It's like, well, hang on a second. What?
And
Yeah.
that's the
Oh, I see. I see. If you come up with the idea, it's great.
Mhm.
If he comes up with the idea, it sucks.
and that was the third thing, was the National Energy Program, because like I finally have somebody who knows history from Alberta. So as an Easterner,
Mhm.
like, because when you said at first that the first one was really bad, but there was some, so okay, the first one was really bad. Was there a lot of resistance to changing it for the second one, or was like, oh darn, like we done fucked up, and yeah, sure, let's fix it. And then
Uh,
what the one that remained after this, like how was the first one was really bad, but the second one, then was it as bad as because that's the one people lived with them under the
yeah.
longest, right? So like how bad was that?
I think the first one was quite bad and just in how it was limiting how much money Alberta could make. And then the second one, I just kind of finished writing about Peter Lougheed, and it was just done in a way that it wouldn't impact Alberta's economy as much. So I think it wasn't as bad. It was kind of a better compromise that happened.
Mhm.
Um, it was kind of around the same time that we were negotiating the Constitution in 1982. So I think there was a
Mhm.
lot of give and take with that, the notwithstanding clause and things like that. So no, it wasn't quite as bad. Like I don't know a lot of the details about it. I was 3, I think.
Mm.
So I've kind of lived with that my entire life. And obviously, it wasn't so bad that Alberta couldn't make a lot of money. Yeah, we did have a recession in the 1980s, but when I
Mhm.
was 23, every person in Alberta got $400 because we had
Mhm.
so much money. And we had a thing called the Heritage Fund, which we just,
Succeeding high.
yeah, we just were throwing money in. And that was created by Peter Lougheed. And it was
Mhm.
an
Mhm.
unbelievable idea. And Norway saw that and went, hey, that's a good idea. The difference is Norway didn't touch theirs, and now technically everybody
Nope.
in Norway is a millionaire. In
That's right.
Alberta, we would just be like, "Oh yeah, we need money to whatever, build a pipeline or build this. Just
Mhm.
take it out of the Heritage Fund." And then there was no money in the Heritage Fund. It was a savings account that you just kept dipping into. But I mean, by the 90s, we were having better years with oil, and then especially in the 2000s, with Alberta, we tend to think that the good times will always last. So we think, oh,
Mm.
the oil prices are high, they will be high for absolutely ever, nothing is going to change, and we stick to
Hence,
that. And you see that now. The
hence
Mhm.
the please God send us another oil boom.
Yeah,
I swear we won't squander it
we
this time
won't
or something.
exactly, we won't screw it up
How many
this
times
time.
have we heard that?
Yeah,
Like 4 times, I think, at least,
this
She
since the
time.
got up there,
70s?
like she's sitting up there and go, "Oh no, not this time." She's like, "How
Yeah.
many times you fooled me with that one?"
Yeah, Alberta's won the lottery like 3 or 4 times, and they blow all the money, and then they're like, "Honest to God, if I win it one more time, I'm gonna do it right." But y they never do, and they always spend all of their money, and don't get me wrong, when I was 22, 23, getting $400 was like, "Hey, this is great." But at the same
Mhm.
time, that money probably could have gone to something else, but it was an election year, so that was
Yeah.
an effort to get elected, and that's something you've actually seeing now with Calgary suddenly getting a new,
300
yeah,
million.
a new arena, because when Rogers Place was being built, there was no money from the government. Even
Nothing.
Daniel Smith was saying, "No, we should not be giving money for this." But now that we're a month away from an election, it's like, yeah, but it'll only happen after the election. So, make sure
Yeah.
you vote us in
Vote for me.
or you won't
Yeah,
get it,
yeah.
which is
So
real shady.
really, so the National Energy Program, the first one is bad. I don't know if this is a myth or not, but as an Easterner, this is what I always heard, is that when oil was booming, it wasn't as great for Alberta because you couldn't make as much as you could have. But then when the OPEC crisis hit, it wasn't as bad because the loss was sort of like, or the price didn't drop as far relative to the rest of the world in Alberta as it did because there was a control on the bottom.
Yeah, I think there was a plateau for the how much could be made from oil. A lot of people forget that things like Petro-Canada were created by the Liberals as a means for dealing with, the oil crisis and giving Canada more control over its oil. And Petro-Canada used to be a crown corporation until Brian
Mhm.
Mulroney made it privatized, and it became. And that's something you saw in Alberta a lot in the 90s, where we suddenly privatized everything. We
Mhm.
don't have government run liquor stores. We have liquor stores everywhere because it's privatized. Same with
Yeah.
AGT became TELUS and things like that.
Mhm.
But with the National Energy Program, it was to kind of I believe to kind of deal with things like inflation, to create a plateau, to keep things from getting out of hand. And it definitely benefited the East better than the West because it did limit how much Alberta could make. But like you said, when prices were low, it's kind of a good thing. It's kind of like an interest rate that you lock into,
Mhm.
where, if you're locked in at 5%, if the interest rate goes up, well, you're benefiting. But if it goes down, or if it goes down, then you're not benefiting because you're locked in at that interest rate. But eh, Alberta doesn't like anything being meddled into with what we do. We want to be like Americans, where it's laissez-faire, where just
Mhm.
there is no government interference. Just let us do whatever we want to do, uh, and we always think we're going to be right with it. And I mean, with our GDP definitely fell a bit with the National Energy Program, and I think with how the Eastern government or Ottawa dealt with it hurt a lot of people, and that's where you really
Mhm.
started to see Western separation becoming a topic
So
for
it was more the
people.
response to it that
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, and then but you had a really good premier with Peter Lougheed, who
Mhm.
knew you have to work with the government. You can't just sit here and go,
Mhm.
"You guys are terrible, you're horrible, and everything you do is bad." You have to work with them. You have to sit down, and you may not agree with what they're doing, but the two sides can find a middle ground, and that's kind of what they
Yep.
did, where they were able to kind of work with that. And I do believe the National Energy Program eventually disappeared. It was just eventually gone, especially
Mhm.
when Brian Mulroney came in. Uh, but I don't think you'd see something like that today. Like if
Okay.
you tried to put something like that in, I think Alberta would lose its mind and would refuse to work with the federal government. And just look at how we reacted over the carbon tax.
So how long would it have been in place total about? Like
I
not even 10
believe
years?
Yeah, I believe from about 78 to about 84, 85 is how long
Okay.
it was in place. But it was especially bad in the early 1980s, and that was kind of a great time of recession for Alberta.
Yeah.
It was really good in terms of sports because we were winning a lot of Stanley Cups, but in terms of money coming in, we weren't doing so well.
Okay, no, it's good to get some clarity because you hear the
Mhm.
stories and and how much is myth, how much is true. It's almost it's
Mhm.
almost the Western equivalent of the Night of the Long Knives story, right?
Yes,
For
Mhm.
the
yeah,
East, right? Like this,
yeah,
the great betrayal, all at the hands of and both of them at the hands of a Trudeau. Go ahead. Go figure.
yeah, absolutely. And Alberta will compare itself to Quebec a lot.
Yeah.
And I remember Saskatchewan saying we need something to, Saskatchewan is a country within a country, and it's like, no, you're not. Like you guys have, you love the Rough Riders, and you have a certain kind of culture with that, but that is nothing compared to Quebec, which has a culture going back hundreds of years, which has dealt with legislation banning
Mhm.
French, which has dealt with the attempts at assimilation. It is
All,
nothing
all those
dissimilar.
schools acts.
Exactly. Yeah. The Schools Acts, not listening to Quebec with conscription and things like that. So there is definitely a country within a country there. And in Alberta, we
Well,
tend to think the same way. We're like, oh, we're our own culture. And we also rail on Quebec more than probably any other
yeah,
That's the
province.
anybody.
irony,
Easy.
right?
Yeah.
It's like in this
Without a doubt.
it's almost like everything in the late 70s and early 80s that Alberta was saying about Quebec was bad is everything they're saying now we want.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, let's rewind there for a second. You mentioned something about how Quebec has its unique culture, and there was certain rules and laws and things that took place. That now, if you saw the Rocket Richard film a few years ago, there's a scene that I learned about Canadian history and Quebec that I didn't know about and was never taught in school. And that scene shows when they separated the English fans from the French fans, and they had a gate and a fence in the Montreal Forum.
I did not.
I did not know this. And so I looked into it. Yeah, that was real.
Mhm.
So I'm like, okay, now I get where a lot of that anger's coming from. They were treated much like the Irish are treated in the UK.
Mhm. Yeah.
Not just second class citizens, but they'd have like signs out, no Jews, no French, no dogs. I'm like, what? This shit really happened.
Yeah.
I was shocked out of my mind. I'm like, why have I never learned of this? Oh, that's right, because history is taught by the victor.
Yeah, we leave that part, those kind of things out. But in Quebec,
Wow.
especially in places like Quebec City and Montreal, it was the Anglophones who were the rich, who controlled the industries, and it was the Francophones who did all the work. Also, the Irish a bit in places like
Yes.
Griffintown. And so, like when the 1885 smallpox epidemic hit, it decimated the Francophone population because they lived in conditions that were extremely poor because they didn't have the money. Where you had all of these, railway tycoons
Mount
and
Royal,
yeah, exactly,
yes.
Mount Royal, who
Westmount,
and they were all Anglophones, and so there was this
Mhm.
real anger towards that, and so the French have all are the Quebecois have always kind of felt like they've been pushed down either by say Anglophones or the Catholic Church. I mean, Quebec did not get its own Department of Education until the 1960s,
Right.
when the Quiet Revolution started, and the Richard Riot was a kind of a birth of that Quiet Revolution that
It really was.
liberalized Quebec a bit. But yeah, comparing Alberta and Saskatchewan to Quebec and their histories and what the French have had to deal with is not even close. Alberta has had
And
a
again,
really good
they don't
history.
teach that.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't teach it. And I'm like, this should be, people need to know the history and why there was so much anger in Quebec for so long. And I lived in Quebec for a long time. I have a lot of family in Montreal. I go to Montreal. Well, it's an hour and a half away. So I'm there a lot. And I love the province of Quebec. I lived there for like 10 years. Military kid, lived all over. But things I didn't know that when you find out, and again, I found out through a film. I'm like, what? And then, of course, I did the research. I looked into it to find out that, yes, this was a real thing. I had no idea. And it's like, now I understand where so much of that anger comes from and why so many people now, new generations don't feel that way because they've not been treated in that manner. But the older generations were like, the rest of English Canada hates us. And I'm kind of like, well, no, I don't. I don't know anybody who does it. But it's coming from a place of where they were taught and told and treated to be lesser than.
During the Quebec
That sticks around.
during the Quebec referendum in 1995, I was 15, and I do remember being in school and hearing teachers and adults around me saying, "Let Quebec leave. They want to be here. Let them go." And it's like, and then later on, when I learned more, it's like, you have no idea how detrimental that would be to Canada. We would lose Quebec, and then we'd lose the Maritimes because there's this big gap between the two. So they're probably going to join the United States. And then go ahead 20 years later, and Alberta saying, well, we don't like what you're doing. We should separate. This is exactly what you were getting on Quebec about 20 years ago. And Quebec would have a much better chance of succeeding than Alberta ever would.
Yeah.
Well, they've got a very diversified economy for one, but also they could hitch their wagon to any one of a number of European nations if they chose to.
And they have the St. Lawrence, an actual connection to the ocean.
Yeah.
Which
there's your trade
which
route
is important.
Right there, right?
And when you're talking about the connecting to the other nations, they've already been doing that work. It's in their economic. They almost have like a tiny diplomatic core of their own in a way. So it's so those relations are established. It would be almost like the UK when they wanted to do the free trade agreement with us, and how it got done rather relatively quickly because we were the nation most likely, given that we had just signed CETA and given our historic ties and whatnot, so that they could get one and say, okay, now here's the model that we're going to go out to the rest of the world and try and negotiate the other ones upon.
Absolutely.
So, now, correct me if I'm wrong, Craig. As you may know, I would imagine you would know the history on this more than I would. Is that treaty lands throughout the province of Quebec? If Quebec was to separate, it would be basically maybe part of Gaspé, the St. Lawrence Seaway, a good portion of it, if you will, the St. Lawrence River. Maybe part of Montreal, definitely Quebec City up to Chicoutimi, but most of the province goes back to the Indigenous people, does it not?
I believe so. It's the same out in the West where,
Yeah.
it is treaty land, and reserves are federal land, which goes back to the whole thing with the Natural Resources Act and
Mhm.
Daniel Smith losing her mind on that. So I do believe that it does go back to the Indigenous in Quebec. Now they might work out some kind of treaty to stay
Of
within
course,
Quebec
yeah.
or things like that. But with any treaty land anywhere in Canada, that's their land. That it's essentially a federal land, kind of under the Indian Act. I don't know if it's kind of the same type of thing now,
Mhm.
but it's still it's not provincial land. It's the provinces have no say over any kind of indigenous land or indigenous reserves or anything like that. They don't administer it, nothing like that.
And those are agreements with the Crown
Yeah,
too, correct?
yeah, exactly. Treaties 1 through 11 were all signed with
Mhm.
the Crown, and they take up pretty much all of Western Canada. Not really much
Well, let's
of
have a look.
the northwestern part of BC. A bit of the territories, but Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, half of Ontario. That's all treaty
Mhm.
land, and that was
Yes.
stipulated in when we got Rupert's Land from the British.
Right.
They said you have to negotiate with the Indigenous. Now, that doesn't mean that we're negotiating in good faith. Like, there are a lot of things we did not hold up our end. But I mean, I've known Indigenous people who say that they still get, $5 every year from the government because of
Yeah.
that treaty. And even I think it's the Jay Treaty of 1792, somewhere around there. Indigenous people are allowed to go over the border between Canada and the United States
Mm.
without a passport because of that treaty that was signed. So there's a lot of things that, even before Canada, that play in, and we see that in Quebec. And I think Quebec would be very careful if they were to separate to work with the Indigenous because of what happened
Mhm.
with Oka in 1990, where they wanted to build a golf course on Mohawk land, and they blocked, a dirt road,
Mhm.
and we sent in the military. Essentially, we used up
Bandu's.
yeah, we used up the Canada's entire supply of barbed wire to deal with this.
Mhm.
Which then I kept thinking about Oka when I was seeing what
Hmm.
was happening in Ottawa, and I was like, they were blocking a dirt road, and they did block a bridge in Montreal, but
Mhm.
really,
Yeah, the
you know,
Mercier Bridge.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Ottawa was like taken over in a way.
It was an occupation.
Yeah,
It was taken
without
over
a
completely.
doubt. But when Oka happened, simply because they didn't want their land turned into a golf course, or a golf course expanded onto their land,
Mhm.
Canada lost their minds, and we freaked
Yeah.
out over it. But
But that didn't happen. And you look at what happened, a year ago in Ottawa here, and the people are still railing about there was no need for the Emergencies Act. I'm like, yeah, I've got a slightly different opinion than you because I lived in the middle of it.
mhm,
It was needed, and the way it was dealt with, the way they kettled everybody together, and I mean, that is a textbook method on how to disperse an occupation like that. Nobody was shot. Nobody was killed.
mhm.
There were a couple of very minor
Not
scrapes
even
and
no tear
bruises.
gas was even used.
Yeah,
They didn't use tear gas. And they said, well, they pepper sprayed. Yeah, the occupiers pepper sprayed the police. No, we didn't. You filmed it. I saw
yeah.
it. I watched it live.
You yelled about no
You know,
freedom, and you were in a hot tub, and you had bouncy castles, and you were having barbecues, and the police were just walking around you. Like,
literally, I walked up my street. I live on Metcalfe Street. Parliament Hill is at the end of my street. It's 1,000 meters from my front door to the Centennial Flame. Exactly 1,000 meters. Walking up the street, and there are bonfires on street corners. They're sitting around drinking beer. I'm like, if I walk around the streets with a beer, I get into trouble.
yeah,
I can smoke a joint. I don't. I don't partake of cannabis, but I could smoke a joint standing next to a cop. But if I pull out a can of beer, I get arrested. They did nothing. They had disco dance parties that raged till 2 a.m. in front of the most expensive real estate in the city. And they're like, "Oh no, it wasn't that bad. Nobody lives there." That's a condo building right beside the Chateau Laurier.
yeah.
That's where they set up their DJ. It's the most expensive real estate in Ottawa.
Hmm.
I thought about that
But
with what I do with podcasting. What would I do for 3 weeks? I can't record because of
Oh,
the noise that's outside. So
I
you've
couldn't go
just hurt
home.
my income. Yeah, you've
Yeah.
prevented people from working. I can't imagine how tired some people were dealing with that every night for
I didn't
3 weeks.
sleep.
Exactly. So what about them? And but out west here, I mean, I saw tons of people driving in support. I saw people on the side of the road waving Canadian flags, and it's
Mhm.
like, what are you even protesting, man? I don't.
Well, and that was the thing. I yelled at them, telling them, "You're in the wrong damn city. If you're against vaccine mandates and masks and restrictions, go to Queen's Park and talk to Doug Ford.
Yeah,
Go to your provincial legislature or your provincial parliament. None of this has anything to do with Justin Trudeau. They just hated Trudeau, so they wanted to. Well, if you read the MOU from James Bowder, they wanted to dissolve the government and install their own people. So, yeah,
yeah,
that's
which
democracy.
shows a complete misunderstanding of how Canadian politics work, like at a
Yeah,
fundamental level. But
Right.
I live in
the
Alberta.
most basic.
I see every day an F Trudeau sticker, at least on one vehicle. I mean, every day I see at least one.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about, actually, I wanted to ask you, because on that, we were wondering that on the map, there's the zones that have the colors and they have the
Mhm.
treaty number and the years. As- the places that have none of those colors, what is the status? Is that what they call the unceded territories, or are the treaties the unceded ones?
I I believe those are the unceded territories. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
because the territories or the treaty lands were ceded to the
Okay.
government
Yes.
in exchange for reserves, food, a variety of things. So in places like BC, it worked different because BC was already a province. All the unceded land was essentially the territories. And then as time went on, Manitoba and Ontario started to grow. Alberta and Saskatchewan came into Canada after those treaties were signed. So in those areas, that is still Indigenous land. There are still like land claims out there, especially in BC. There's been a
Mhm.
lot of work to
Yeah.
acknowledge that there's Indigenous land. I think the Queen Charlotte Islands were even renamed to Hattagway or something like that.
Yeah. Hattagwai. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
because of that, because it
Mhm.
is Indigenous land. So I think it works a bit different, especially in BC. And then in Quebec, the treaties that were done for those go back centuries because Quebec and the Maritimes were really the first places that were really settled by Europeans, in the
Mhm.
1600s.
Mhm.
Mhm. I have a video clip here, gents, of talking about treaties, and I'm just going to put this on the screen. I'll play this. It's about a minute and 38 seconds from Global Saskatoon. Sorry, have a look at this. It's interesting.
You can find the nearest coffee shop or borders of a neighborhood on Google Maps, but you can't find the boundaries of historic treaties signed between First Nations and the Crown.
Let's back that up for just a second there. So, Upper Canada Treaty, Williams treaties. So, because Ottawa is on unceded Algonquin territory, I guess that's part of the Williams Treaty by the look of this map.
Yeah.
And the Crown. One Saskatoon city planner who uses Google Maps all the time says that's a problem.
It just sort of amazed me that something so foundational to our country and our identity and our geography wasn't located there.
He says urban development isn't just about land. It's also about people, culture, and history. That's why he wants online mapping tools to mark treaty territories. Saskatchewan's Office of the Treaty Commissioner says doing so would serve as an educational opportunity.
Just in terms of getting people's interest in treaties, I think it's very important.
The OTC is working to find the coordinates of treaty boundaries so the province can put up highway signs marking the territory. It's a challenge as federal maps aren't exact and boundary descriptions in the treaties are complex.
We have to be very careful when we're looking at treaty areas and make sure that we incorporate the oral histories as well.
It wouldn't be an easy task, but Sheldon Krasowski says it's possible with the help of archives, elders, and modern mapping technology. The director of a local friendship center says if online maps eventually mark treaty areas, it's crucial they also show traditional Métis territory.
There is a shared territory, it's a shared history, we're all related, and I think that if they're going to tell that story, they need to complete the whole story.
He says doing so would offer a deeper understanding of the land and help push reconciliation forward. Anna McMillan, Global News.
Now, I think that's pretty cool that there's a push for it because, once again, something I wasn't taught in school.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's a very important part of our history, which we should know. And with modern technology, let's make it available to people.
Yeah, I think it'd be very easy to do that. There is a website you can go to called Indigenous Map where you can type in any place in Canada and it'll show you the Indigenous nations that live there, including the Métis. But I think having something like that where when you are on Google Maps, it does show that, for example, where I am, Treaty 6, that this was treaty land. And I think the only reason that even a lot of people in Edmonton know that they're on Treaty 6 is because before every Oilers game, there is an acknowledgement for Treaty
Yes,
6, which I don't think is extremely common in the other teams.
We here in Ottawa, that statement gets made a lot. We're on the unceded Algonquin people's land. I don't know if they say it before hockey games. They used to say it on Parliament, and then a lawyer came to them and said, "You need to stop doing that." Like, why? Because the government is officially recognizing that we shouldn't be here on this land, and you might open up a whole new kettle of fish that could become a major problem. So they had to stop saying that because they didn't realize that they were creating an issue out of it. And I'm like, yeah, an issue that will be in courts for what, a century? Like, back, it would be in there forever. So I just put a link in the chat to it's called Native Land Digital, and it's kind of like Google Earth, and it's really cool. It's fully interactive, and it shows the Algonquin. If you check on the link, I'll just show you quickly of what it looks like here. It's really cool. Yeah, I'll just pull this up.
Oh yeah, this is what I was talking about. Yeah,
so this shows everything. So here, right? Let's scroll in a little bit further. So there's Montreal, which is Mohawk territory, right? Anishinaabe, like my pronunciation is going to be bad, but Ottawa is right around here, and you can see this is all the different treaty territories, right?
Mm-hmm.
And each one is just, it tells you everything, which is, I think this is really cool.
Yeah, it's
this map.
It's a really good resource. I used to do a lot of history of small towns, and I'd always begin the history of the small town with the Indigenous history, and that map was great for kind of knowing what Indigenous nations were part of it. Because where I am, it's like, okay, I know that this is kind of Cree land, but for other places in Canada, you got to make sure that you know exactly who was essentially here before Europeans started to arrive.
Oh yeah. Well, and look at the difference if we just go over here to Europe. We've got Norway and some northern Russia, and that's kind of it, right? The Sami people. And then the rest of Europe is nope. Now, Northern Africa, you've got a lot of different tribal things.
Yeah.
And get down into the I think you pronounce it. So that covers like South Africa, Botswana, a bit of Zimbabwe, Zambia, Anyway, very cool little resource for anybody who wants to check that out. I put the link in the chat. It's native-land.ca.
Yeah, just on a side note, the Sami people that you had mentioned in Finland were they were a core issue in the recent election there.
That's right.
There were deals made, and it seems that the one of the parties didn't want to actually deliver on one of them.
Well, because the Sami people are in Finland, Sweden, and Norway. That whole it covers all three nations, right?
So this other thing, how would I put it? All of this is wrapped around this bigger promise that Danielle Smith had about an Alberta Sovereignty Act. And then Scott Moe said, "Oh, that sounds like a great idea. Let's do that too." And then, of course, turns out it was unconstitutional, and she backtracked a lot. And you have the Onion Lake Cree Nation who are suing both the governments of Saskatchewan and of Alberta. Could you explain, with regard to treaties taking precedence over creations of provinces and all that kind of stuff, with how do you put it? How the idea was never if you knew minimal about constitutional history, Because how that act was never good, that idea was never going to fly. Like from the second she said it, this is something that you're just raising money off of because this cannot possibly happen. In other words, I like to play this game. In order for this to be true, what else must also be true?
Mhm.
So for that to be possible, right? She could say, "Oh yeah, we're going to have this sovereignty." Yeah. What would have had to be possible? Why is it not? Right?
Short answer, Ottawa doesn't exist and Alberta is its own country because the federal government has jurisdiction over certain things, and that's something that doesn't change. Sometimes it does, like the Natural Resources Act, but often it doesn't. So when I heard her say that, it was an immediate, like, that does not seem like something you can do. That is like me saying, I don't feel like following this law, and I'm not going to. That's exactly what happened. And it didn't matter because the people around her were like, "Oh, yeah. Yeah, I like this. You're gonna just tell the government that you're not gonna listen to them." You can't do that. The federal government can make laws that we have to abide to. The carbon tax is a perfect example of that.
Mhm.
And even that, with the carbon tax, we actually had our own put in by the NDP, which actually was more beneficial to the Alberta economy. But when Jason Kenney was running for in the 2019 election, he said, "I'm going to get rid of the carbon tax," and that was more or less the main point of his election. And people didn't look any further into it. All they heard was he's going to get rid of it. They didn't look to see that as soon as we got rid of the NDP's provincial carbon tax, the federal carbon tax comes into place because it's a federal tax. You can take it to Supreme Court like they did, and you
Mhm.
can lose, and it still exists. So you can either work with it or you don't. So for Danielle Smith to say, I'm just not going to follow this, whatever it may be, whether it's a tax or especially anything to do with oil and gas, you can't do it because you may not like Ottawa, but Ottawa is the governing body of this entire country. And there are certain things you have control over: healthcare, provincial roads, a variety of things. But there's certain things you can't. She also tried that with the national parks, where she said, we're going to start collecting the money from the national parks.
Right.
No, you're not, because that's federal land. You have no say over that whatsoever. But it doesn't matter. It's playing to the base and the people who don't like Ottawa and don't like Trudeau and don't look any further into what she's saying. And so that's why she became leader. And as soon as she became leader, as soon as she became premier, and I fully believe she knew that it was unconstitutional. There's no way she could have come in here. There was no way that there was nobody around her who did not say, this will not work. She wanted to become premier, and that's all that mattered. And then as soon as she becomes premier, well, this is what I meant. I meant we'll fight more for certain things. Whereas before, it was almost saying, we're going to do whatever we want. We will ignore any federal law we don't like.
Mm-hmm.
And then afterwards was, well, we'll work with them. And then, like you said, kind of died away. She stopped mentioning it because she knew that there's nothing she could do. Anytime you take this case to a court, you're going to lose because it's unconstitutional. There's nothing that you can do about it. But people don't look any further. They look for those Twitter bites and those Twitter posts and those especially memes. I mean, I'm seeing so many politicians now putting out memes with just a quick bit of information, and then people don't look any further into it. They don't look, is this in context or is it not in context? And a good example is what happened with natural resources. Is this actually in context? Are they actually taking our national resources? Let me look a little bit further into this. But people look at it and go, no, and yeah, they're trying to take our resources. That sounds like Justin Trudeau to me. He should apologize, even though he had nothing at all to do with this minor comment that has no impact on my life whatsoever. But you see it a lot, and the Sovereignty Act was a good example of that. And that's why it's not being brought up in this election. I mean, it probably will be brought up by the NDP because technically it's a failed promise. You know, if you want to anger her base, say, well, what, she didn't do anything with the Sovereignty Act. You know, they did pass the Sovereignty Act, kind of, but they didn't do anything with it. So she kind of broke a promise to her base. So if you want to attack her, that's a good way to do it. But I don't think you'll see Danielle Smith say anything about the Sovereignty Act during the election at all, except maybe in a debate if she's asked about it.
You saw her comments the other day about how she wants to emulate Ron DeSantis and Kristi Noem from South Dakota and
Yeah.
Florida. Like,
Yeah,
Yeah.
that one I don't understand. It's like, talk. I'll get.
there's nothing redeemable about either one of those people or any of the legislation, if you want to call it that they've passed. With if she's a bastion of freedom, they've taken people's freedoms away.
Yeah. But it's playing to the base. It's playing to the
Yes.
people who follow her. And that's a big problem for conservatives now, is that they play to that base. They focus on the people who already support them. Peter Lougheed won a huge majority in 1971 because he played to his base and he played to people who were unhappy with the Social Credit Party. He didn't just focus on these people. He said, I can help you too. And you're seeing with Pierre Poilievre, he's playing to a base and it's going to hurt him in places like Quebec and places like Ontario. And if we get to the election, if he wins, it's going to cost him a majority government. And we'll have another minority government, which I'm actually in favor of because I don't want Pierre Poilievre to have a majority government. I like having a minority government. Even like a majority government if it was an NDP leading or if it was a Liberal leading, because it's great checks and balances. Like the whole reason we got an apology for the Residential Schools Act by the Conservatives was because Jack Layton had a lot of power in a minority government and he pushed the Conservatives to do something like that. So I kind of hope for that. But in Alberta, you will not have a minority government. We have never had a minority government. We're a two-party system. It's one or the other. So whoever wins on May 29th is going to have a majority government. And I don't know what's going to happen in the next 4 years if Danielle Smith has a majority government where she has no checks and balances.
Well, I'm reading here something. There's an article in the Globe and Mail. I don't know if you've seen this, Mr. Beaver. It's the comment I see is from Jason Markusoff. Yeah. He said Premier Danielle Smith attended Take Back Alberta leader David Parker's wedding last month.
Oh, there you go.
So Carrie Tate reports in this piece on an insurgent group trying to transform the UCP from the inside. Maybe that's where her commentary about Ron DeSantis and Kristi Noem is coming from.
Here's the thing you mentioned. I got the asset up there ready for you.
I still see the map.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I need to change the screen. Sorry. It's interesting that you mentioned Pierre Poilievre in Quebec because before we came on the show, I was just listening to Chantal Hebert saying that she sorry, excuse me. Sorry, got something stuck.
It happens.
The most recent Léger poll says that on the metric of preferred prime minister, that Poilievre is only scoring about 13% in Quebec, which is 1% more than Jagmeet Singh or low like this. And she said, and he can't get the time of day in that province. But it's mostly been on his attack on CBC because, you can't constitutionally separate CBC from Radio-Canada. And if he wants to defend one, if he wants to defend one, he has to defund the other. And he's only talking about the CBC and his broadcasting plans in English, but not in French, which of course makes everybody more suspicious. So it was just interesting that you mentioned that because I was like, oh yeah, there's that little data point there I could slide in. But with with Danielle Smith, I've got the clip there, and let's put it up and I'm going to play it twice because I want you to hear what she says the first time, and then I'm going to direct you to some body language.
In the interim, we can assert some freedom, assert that we're going to do things a different way. Maybe we get a cross-border agreement with Ron DeSantis. Maybe he has a little zone in Florida that we would be able to fly direct to. Maybe we can develop bilateral agreements with other free states, red state jurisdictions in the U.S., or even internationally that would allow for us to have a little more autonomy. I don't know, but I think it's worth trying.
Okay. Now, first thing, right? What she's actually proposing here, what I'm hearing is, let's reduce our world. Maybe Ron DeSantis could give us a little zone in Florida, not all of Florida, just this little zone. Maybe a couple of other red states. Maybe we can do business with that. Well, you can already do business independently with other states. You actually have an Alberta trade office, don't you?
Yes.
That actually goes down there and trade. So I mean, okay. Now here's the thing I want you to look at the second time. Look at every time she looks away from the camera and every time she says something to the camera. And when she's looking away with the camera, listen to the words she's saying. And when she's looking at the camera, listen to what she's saying. I noticed this.
In the interim, we can assert some freedom, assert that we're going to do things a different way. Maybe we get a cross-border agreement with Ron DeSantis. Maybe he has a little zone in Florida that we would be able to fly direct to. Maybe we can develop bilateral agreements with other free states, red state jurisdictions in the US, or even internationally that would allow for us to have a little more autonomy. I don't know, but I think it's worth trying. In the interim,
what do you notice? Every time she's looking away, it's this little throwaway thing like this. And every time she delivers back to the camera, it's like, oh, I'm just spitballing. Here's the thing I put a lot of thought into. Maybe Ron DeSantis can make us a little zone in Florida that we can go to. Oh, I don't know. Maybe we can make trade agreements with other reds. Every single thing that she's thought about, she delivers direct, and everything else she just makes it. Oh, let's say it's. Oh, this just came to me.
Just a hypothetical.
This is extremely rehearsed. She practiced this in front of a mirror several times before she did this before the camera.
Yeah,
and again, it's all sounds so reasonable. Let's just explore this. Why not?
Well, maybe we can have our own little space. Isn't that like creating an ethno state? Is that what she's trying to do? You know, like.
But I'm hearing like, abusive spouses or cult leaders. Hey, Alberta, I mean, your family's just keeping you down. I mean, maybe we need to talk to these people over there. We create this little space where we can all hang out together, and maybe I can isolate you away from everybody that you love so that you can listen to only me.
She just didn't say the words. We'll create a safe space. That's basically what she said. She just didn't use those words. We'll create a safe space for freedom-loving patriots. She didn't say the words, but I heard them.
Yeah, and it appeals to people who do believe her, and she maintains that they're hypotheticals. But again, if you look at what she's saying, where you can just fly down to Florida, well, Alberta doesn't have control over, flying.
No,
to put it simply, airspace. Yeah, that's
and neither does Ron DeSantis.
The Canadian government. Exactly, that's the United States government and the Canadian government have control over that. So you can't be like, oh, there's a place you can fly to Florida. You don't need a passport. It's like a little. It's like a little, how you have a little Italy in a city. It's a little
or on
Alberta.
an Alberta passport, special Alberta passport.
Yeah, exactly. Which only gets you this one spot in Florida for some reason. So you can go, it's right next to Disney World, and he'll let us. We can just hang out there, and everything will be fine. And it's like, why there? And again, you have to look at the details. And once you take a quick look at the details, within a few seconds, you realize that this will never happen.
Yeah.
And I don't know why you're suggesting it.
Well, it's almost like the barbaric practices snitch line thing again, right? It's like, if your neighbor, regardless of whatever religion they practice or they don't practice one, whatever their ethnicity, or if they're being barbaric to it, we already have a snitch line for that. It's called 911. We don't need to create a special one specifically for these people for this specific activity. And it's just like, you want to go to that special little zone in Florida that Ron DeSantis will make for you? You can already do that with a Canadian passport.
Yeah. And a plane ticket that you buy from Air Canada.
It's just like,
let me put a link in the chat here for everybody. And gents, I suggest you click on this link, because if you go to this story, now this is not Alberta, this is about Ontario, but it's another snitch line.
Yeah.
Social assistance recipients, spouses, and children. So let's, what do the conservatives always do? Punch down on the poor, downtrodden, marginalized members of society. That's your money they're wasting. Hey, Doug, can you stop spending money on destroying the Ontario Science Centre in Ontario Place and handing it over to a European company for 95 years? Just a little thing.
And one thing we didn't mention with Alberta is the push to have our own provincial police force, which literally nobody wants. No, Grand Prairie does, but like small towns, nobody wants this.
No.
Edmonton and Calgary already have their own police forces, and I think Lethbridge might, but I don't know for sure. But yeah, nobody wants this, but it's a big promise and it'll cost more, but it's about having more control over, I'm not, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying like she's going to have secret police and things like
Mhm.
that, but it is about having more control over the police force and what they can and cannot do. And you don't have that with the RCMP.
No.
And it'll cost us more money, and we already did this. We did this from 1917, I think, to 1932, and we got rid of it because we couldn't afford it anymore. We needed the RCMP, and
But if you're a province that wants to do that kind of thing with oil and mining and resources, and you have a lot of environmental protesters and a lot of indigenous
exactly,
protesters, that could come in very handy.
exactly, you support the convoy going to Ottawa, but if any Indigenous people block a train track from sending oil, that's a big deal. That's a problem, and you saw that a lot in the past year where it's okay to do this. This is freedom fighting. This is wrong. And don't do this because this hurts the economy, but blocking the border doesn't.
All right. Final question for you. This one's less history.
Sure.
This one's current. According to most pollsters at the moment, and even before going into it, seems that this was going to be all about battleground Calgary. Because the Edmonton's very NDP, most of the rest of Alberta is UCP. There might be some drop in UCP vote in more metro areas of smaller Alberta, like Lethbridge or Medicine Hat. We got a little hint of that in the by-election. And the most recent data I saw seems to be indicating that there are places in Calgary that are leaning about 5 to 7% more NDP at the moment. But the latest Janet Brown polling that they had divided the city of Calgary into 4 quadrants, and it's almost like there's a north-south divide also in the city. Based on what you see going on, based on your finger on the pulse, would something like the hockey arena thing infuriate more people in Calgary itself, like in the urban area where they need the votes? It may solidify more votes in the rural areas, but in the urban area itself, would it do that? Do you see the decision to take fewer and fewer and fewer questions affecting, like, how's that going over in the city itself?
I think the decision to take less and less questions won't have a big impact because people don't care maybe too much about that. But I think the arena is going to have a major impact. There will be some who are like, this is awesome. Great. We're getting rid of the Saddle Dome. And they will, if they were on the fence, maybe they'll go over. But probably a lot of them were already UCP supporters. I don't see like an NDP supporter going, oh, awesome. We're getting an arena. I will support the UCP now. It'll be people who are on the fence or already UCP voters. And you mentioned that north-south divide. I know I used to live in Calgary like 20 years ago, but the northeast is more of minority population, more immigrant population, and isn't usually going to vote for progressive conservative / UCP. So I see more of that being NDP. But I think actually what's going to happen is it's going to hurt the party elsewhere. And it could hurt them in rural areas because people might be thinking, I have to wait this long to get in a hospital, or there's these problems, and you're giving this much money to Calgary for an arena a month before an election. So it actually could cost them in other ridings versus, say, actually costing them in Calgary. Now, there are some where you can take a pop can and write conservative on it, and the people will vote for it because it doesn't matter. They will vote for a conservative. I live in a riding like that. I think it's always been conservative my entire life. But I think the arena will be a big issue. It will be brought up a lot. And even the NDP, they are smart enough to say, if we come into power, we'll get rid of that. They're saying, well, we'll see, we'll address that. Maybe there's something we can do. Because if they say, well, we're not going to support that, then they will actually cost themselves some votes from people who actually do want an arena. So they got to kind of play the middle ground there.
Yeah,
But a lot of people...
we might be okay with it, but we don't think that they've done it the right way.
Yeah,
Because
we'll
if we
figure out a
absolutely
different
have to
way.
do this, leave it with us.
We'll figure out a better way to do this. Yeah. But a lot of people will also see it as just blatant election, trying to essentially bribe an election, bribe the electorate with this. A lot of people will see that, and that will probably get them to go to a different party. Most likely the NDP, but if they don't want to go that far, maybe the Alberta party. But it'll be a two-party election. It'll be close too. Like Alberta doesn't usually have close elections. I think the closest was when we had like 23 members in the opposition and like 40 members in the ruling party. But this one might be close. Like we might actually have like 44 to 40 or whatever it has to be. But and then that can actually, down the road, if there's by-elections, that can shift the balance if, say, the NDP loses but starts winning by-elections, and suddenly you find an unstable government as the years go on. But the arena, I wouldn't have done it. Like, I get why they did it, but I would have promised it 6 months ago.
Yeah.
To do it a month before the election, just a lot of people, it rubs them the wrong way.
Dangling
exactly.
a carrot, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah. And Canadians can be smart with that. When the 2015 election happened and you had the Orange Crush in Quebec, and just a few days before the election, a report suddenly appeared that in the 90s, Jack Layton was at a massage parlor. And it actually hurt the Conservatives because Canadians saw that as, well, that's American style elections.
Right. Yeah.
We're not like that. And it really actually it did hurt them, and it benefited Jack Layton. So we can be knowledgeable when we want to, and we don't like phoniness and people blatantly trying to shift opinions, and that you could see that with the arena.
I like the way you framed it though, because you put an idea in my mind that I hadn't thought about, that if this is it could not be so much about buying the votes. I mean, it is buying the votes, but so much as she's not confident that, sort of like the orphan voters, the people that would probably would not vote NDP, but don't feel they can vote UCP, and let's say Alberta Party is not, or Alberta Independence, and all those, they're not really, Alberta Liberal Party are not interesting, so they just decide to stay home.
Yeah,
like, this might actually just be get out, just a straight already before the election is dropped, panic and get out the vote play.
Oh, without a doubt. And when she was going to run in a by-election, she didn't run in Calgary. She ran in a safe riding, even though there was already a by-election happening. She had somebody step aside so she could run in Brooks Medicine Hat, which is not too far from where she actually lives in High River. I think she still lives there as well. And that's about a half hour south of Calgary. So she's very worried about Calgary.
Well, she wasn't going to win in Calgary Elbow. That's what
exactly.
Going to run.
And this is going to swing the election. Calgary definitely will swing the election because, like you said, Edmonton has been NDP for years and will continue to be NDP. For whatever reason, Edmonton is an NDP zone. Other places, Notley could win in Fairview, Notley, which is where she was born. It's named for her father. But she didn't win the last time. But again, that was kind of a weird election. But rural areas are going to go for the UCP, but some won't. Banff, Canmore, that area, Miranda Rosen's UCP, a lot of people don't like her. That could go to could go to the NDP. So there could be a few rural ridings that do shift over, but yeah, nobody. I think the UCP will be very hurt in Edmonton because of the arena, because we had to pay for it. I mean, I'm a diehard Oilers fan, and I wasn't going to vote for the UCP anyways, but if I was like, oh, which should I vote for? If I would not vote for the UCP now, because I'd be like, well, what the hell? Like, we wanted an arena. We had to scrimp and save and build this arena. And you have two guys who own the Flames who are worth like combined $3 billion. Where's their money? Why aren't they not putting the money into this? Why
they're putting
my taxes?
$7 million.
Yeah. And people will say, well, you put, your taxes pay for a hospital you never use. It's like, well, I don't know.
A little bit different there.
I might need a hospital in Lethbridge one day.
But the guy who might perform my triple bypass 20 years from now might have used that hospital before.
Yeah. Or I might use that road. Like, this is completely different.
Well, one is for profit and one is for people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's for schools to, make good citizens for when I'm in my old age and we
Mhm.
don't live in like a hellish dystopia or something like that. This complex is, if we could do it, if Edmonton could do it, why can't Calgary do it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
But
Well, like you
it's
say,
I,
the owners have the money. They would
yeah,
rather get taxpayers to pay for it if they could.
and
Yeah.
I don't blame the Flames or
Oh, no.
the people because they came to you and said, "We'll give you $330 million." You're like, "Okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
I'll
I'll
take it.
take this."
Right.
Yeah. That's just one level.
Hell, I'd
Yeah,
take
exactly.
Federal
$330, let alone 330 million. Like,
Yeah, I was very shocked when I saw that. I was like, it blew me away to see that because
It-
I did that
so
entire
blatant.
series on Alberta's election history,
yeah.
and you don't see something like that other than say like the Ralph Bucks, the
Mhm.
$400 to everybody. You don't see something where it's so blatant that this is buying votes,
She's
and
not even trying
especially
to hide
because
it.
no, because she said
I know.
this is not going to be signed until after the election. Why not?
Yes.
Why can't you sign? Why could you not sit at the table there and sign it right there? Why
Mhm.
does it have to be after the election? And that also will hurt people because they'll see that as phony
Mhm.
and you're just you're trying to con me into supporting this. And then after the election, you'll sign it. What happens if you don't? What
Yeah.
happens if you like, actually, we can't afford this. I was wrong. They got to figure out a way to pay for this.
Yeah, that
It
could
doesn't
very well
matter
happen too, right?
because now for the next 4 or 5 years, you have the UCP. They've already been elected and they've got a majority.
Well, and the
Yeah.
funny thing is, it's like in the province of Alberta where, you've got people who are staunch NDP supporters and love Rachel Notley. Is it Notley or Notley?
Notley.
Notley, okay. And love her and think she's wonderful. And then you've got other people going, oh, she's too much of a left wing. I'm like, I actually think the Alberta NDP is more in line with the former progressive federal
Yep.
conservative party than they are with the federal NDP party. I mean,
100%.
Joe Clark or Brian Mulrooney would be very comfortable within
Yep.
the confines of the Alberta NDP party. And
So would
what
Christine
is
Campbell.
astonishing is the amount of people that do not recognize that.
Yeah.
They just don't see it. And I'm like, what, do they have to change the name of the party?
Yeah, without a doubt. Peter Lougheed, I definitely think would be
Oh,
NDP,
yeah.
this current NDP. And when I say like I don't vote UCP, I voted for a wide variety of parties. I'm not one of those people who's like, I've always voted liberal and I'm always going to vote liberal.
Yeah, both of us, we're the same way. We're not,
Yeah.
I've voted for multiple different parties, depending upon where I was living, whoever was my best provincial parliament member or federal, whoever I thought was going to do the best for myself, my neighborhood, my friends,
Exactly.
the area we live, the constituency, that person would get my vote because we don't elect a prime minister. We elect a parliament.
Oh, and don't get me started on Pierre Poilievre.
Oh,
When,
dude,
uh, vote for me as to be your prime minister. It's like,
can't do it.
no.
Oh,
Yeah.
you found a friend. There you go.
Can't do
But
it.
I
mean,
let you talk.
That
I
makes my
did vote
blood boil.
for I did vote for Danielle Smith in 2012, 2013,
Mhm.
because I was living in High River. I was interacting with her on a regular basis. She was very nice. She was
Mm.
very approachable. And I found that, okay, yeah, I actually do like who this person is. I thought the Wild Rose could be maybe something different from
Mhm.
the progressive conservatives who had been in power my entire life.
Mhm.
But, now I'm not going to vote for her. And really in Alberta, you don't have many choices. I mean, what do I vote for the Alberta, whatever Independence Party, the Buffalo Party, whatever they are,
Mhm.
the Alberta Party, the NDP, or the UCP? Because you have, like you said, the NDP kind of in the middle, and then everybody else is way off to the
Far
right, and
yeah.
you don't have anything really in the left except for the Green Party. And I might as well just throw my vote in the garbage because the Green Party will never be elected.
Not in Alberta. Never.
No, not even close.
And all the Green Party has ever been from day one has been progressive conservatives that actually give a shit about the environment.
Mhm.
I mean, their platform is not, although Mike Greiner, the provincial leader for the Green Party in Ontario, he's left leaning. And
Mike
so
Reiner,
much, so much so that the Liberal Party's asked him to cross the floor and be the Liberal leader in the province of Ontario. So he's an exception to the rule, I think, when it comes to the Green Party and their politics. But I really like the guy, but that's neither here nor there because we're here to talk about Alberta and how much
Yeah.
people fail to recognize that the NDP in that province is more in line with with the former
Mhm.
federal progressive conservative party. We don't have a
Yeah.
progressive conservative party in Canada right now. Federally, we have a reform party with a new name.
Yeah, and absolutely, the NDP of Alberta is not the same as the NDP of, say, Ontario or the
No,
NDP
they're
in
not.
Quebec. Yeah, they're very more, like you said, the progressive conservatives. They're because they have to walk that line. They
Mhm.
can't come in and say, "We are not gonna support oil," because they will lose all their votes. So they have to kind of be in the middle,
And
not to
Rachel's
be this far.
pro-oil. She's
Yeah,
actually
absolutely.
pro-oil, right?
She
Yeah.
wants pipelines. She
Yeah.
is definitely, but she's
Well,
also
that's
kind
how
of
the TMX pipeline plan got done, right? It was her negotiation
Mhm.
with the
Mhm.
government that got the late work because it wasn't happening with the conservatives because they always found a reason to rail against the judge instead of actually getting it done or the
Yeah,
consultation.
and she just is a bit more not quite to the level of the UCP. She doesn't want coal mining in the mountains, whereas the UCP supports that. And, she wants to work with the federal government a bit more than, say, the UCP does, which doesn't want to work with the federal government at all. But yeah, if you look at the PC leaders, like I don't think Ralph Klein would probably be this NDP, but somebody like Peter Lougheed for sure, I think would be more in line with this NDP versus the PC party as it was in 2015, and essentially as it is now. It's just like you said, it's just a different name. It's still the Progressive Conservatives. It's just they've moved farther to the right and they changed their name.
All right, Mr. Grizzly, do we have a show?
We do indeed, sir.
All right, kits. That's the end of this episode of the True North Eager Beaver Alberta pre-election podcast special. Say that 5 times fast.
No, no.
Huh?
No.
We
I'm not
hope
going
you
to. You can't make me.
Not
No.
even if I have Guinness.
I'm not drinking right now, remember?
Okay.
I'm training. No alcohol.
Sometimes it works.
Oh, hang on a sec. Somebody just sent me a clip from Smith. I just got this like 2 seconds ago. I haven't even looked at it, but it's from the Daniel Smith show. So let's have yeah, it's breaking. It's breaking. I don't know when this aired. Perhaps you've already seen this, Craig, but let's have a look at this. Daniel Smith show.
Is there any way that we could bilateral agreement with the red states, the free states? So you
Doubling
call up
down.
Ron DeSantis and say, hey, do you think we'd be able to allow for charter flights to go to your state so that people can travel back and forth, or do the same thing with Texas and South Dakota and some of the other American states that have the same ethic and attitude that a lot of our residents do here? Would we even have the ability to do that?
That's a good question. And the reason I am
worth trying. Hey,
let me be careful what I say, but
what the actual
that's a no.
Wouldn't it be nice to have control over our own airports? Wouldn't it be nice to have control over our own border crossings?
There it is.
For me, everything's on the table. Alberta is Alberta. We are a sovereign nation within a nation, as far as I'm concerned. I don't think people want to be governed here by bureaucrats and politicians in Ottawa any longer. And I love those ideas. They don't make it in here because people hear it and they're like, "Well, how is that possible?" But really think about it. What right does Ottawa have to tell us who lands at our airports, who comes to our borders? We have to have these discussions. And right now, those are obviously issues where the Constitution says that the feds do have that power, but we also have all the enforcement powers. And if we want to change that, they've certainly changed a lot of the deal. Maybe we need to start thinking on that front. I mean, immigration policy, Quebec already controls their own immigration policy. That's federal. So that changed. So if that's the case, let's control our own immigration policy. And that necessarily means controlling our borders and controlling our airports.
Wouldn't it be interesting to see that happen?
Can you know that little thing at the end, eh? I'm just thinking about it. Wouldn't it be interesting to see that happen?
Yeah. Now I see that just constantly when she started that, like, hey, here's a crazy idea, and then has like all this information about just off the top of my head.
Yeah, and then the wrap up at the end. Yeah, well, it would be nice to see that happen. So next, and the inhale for the next.
Yeah.
So just so you don't have time to think about it. This is very rehearsed.
Oh yeah.
But you see his smile go up. Do you think the airport's like this is right up as that's a no.
Yeah.
Well, everything's on the table.
Yeah, anything can happen. Technically, I mean,
it's statistically possible. I mean, it's 0.00001%. It's on the table. I mean,
yeah. What right does Alberta or does the Canadian government have to say who can land at our airports? Well, They have that
All
right.
of them.
Yeah, that's
All of the rights.
yeah. It's it's their jurisdiction essentially.
Yeah, well, this is cute though. We're going to control who can land at our own airports. Okay. How about we don't let them fly anywhere over Canada?
Yeah.
How are you going to get them to land? If we just stop them, no, you can't fly to over Alberta. We control the airways. You cannot fly over the province of Alberta. You cannot land in Alberta.
Yeah. And do you have an Alberta passport? I don't understand how you control who lands in Alberta. Even from elsewhere in Canada, does that mean like people from, say, BC can't fly in here in certain circumstances?
And how do you get to the special zone in Florida to land to show your Alberta passport to the Florida border agent without first getting through the USA border agent?
Yeah.
And then if I want to leave that zone to go to Disneyland, whatever, do I need my Canadian passport as well to now get out of that zone to go into Florida, which is not within this Alberta zone?
Well, she's being ridiculous because the federal government could say, yeah, you're on your own. Fuck you. You're on your own. You're a landlocked province. Where are you going to fly to?
I feel
and the United States could say, you can't fly over any of these blue states, which are all along the border. Basically, you're fucked, is what
I keep on hearing Avril Lavigne in my head.
Why you got to make things so complicated?
We already have a system that works.
Yeah, but it's not about that. It's about putting an issue forward with no real idea of how to do it, with a clear understanding that it's not going to work. It's a sovereignty act again, and
when it
people
fails, you blame
latch onto it. Yeah,
So
and people latch onto it.
Blame Trudeau and raise more money.
That clip was from May 15th of 2022. So she's been on this for a while now.
Yeah, that's
almost a year old.
Yeah. Wow. It's different now though because she's premier, and so when she says things like that, now people are like, it's on the news. Before it was just this person with a radio show, nobody cared.
Exactly.
Yeah, but as we say in French, ça vient de loin. It comes from way far back there. Yeah, she pulling it forward.
I like this Alberta passports, a rodeo. I'm saying it that way intentionally, so I'll sound like a Laurentian elite from Ontario. The rodeo belt buckle.
Oh man. Okay, kids. Remember that sharing is caring, and word of mouth is priceless. And you have the mouth that we want the words coming out of. So please tell your friends, your foes. We don't care.
Yeah,
right.
Just watch.
Viewership is viewership. Listenership's listenership. Tell them all. Tell them we exist, and tell them also about this very, very, very nice man's series of podcasts. You can find
to my
pardon?
Left. Way over there to my left.
Way over there to your left, which you can find at, I believe it's Canadian History.
There, that guy. Whoop, that guy.
ehx.com, right? RCA?
Yeah, CanadaEHX.com.
There we go. We put it right up there, Mr. Grizzly. We'll even give some visual there.
Yeah, here we go.
Site. That's where you go
to get all that good stuff. All my episodes, all 900 total, I think.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's like one
That's
a
all
day.
I do.
Almost 3 years.
I get up at 6, I work till 5. Putting content, Twitter, all of it.
Yeah, I know. It's a lot, eh?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
We're learning this. We just celebrated our third. Our trailer came out on the 23rd, so we were one day early on the podcast. Mr. Grizzly, wishing ourselves happy birthday, and it's the same thing. It's like, oh my god, we could actually use some staff.
Yeah, we go live every day at 7 a.m. Monday to Friday. Then we do the weekend shows like this from time to time, and then we contribute with other podcasts. I have 2 music podcasts, so it's a busy life.
Yeah, time it can take up.
Yeah, because democracy is something that you do if you live in Alberta. You might want to grab something called a pen and a paper and write some things on it, letting Danielle Smith know that you're not really down for a lot of things that she's proposing. And then, just lick it and throw it into a mailbox, to her at the legislature. You won't even need a stamp for it. And just, might want to let her know that she needs to pull back a little bit on the sovereignty use.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just lay off. She's doing
Dial it back
a little too hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you like this podcast, you can find us on the Crier Media Network, as well as all Beaver Grizzly friendly platforms. Stars and reviews are greatly appreciated. Of course, we will not tell you how many to give us. But, if you happen to be taking a hint from the visual, we are quite fine with that.
High five.
High five. There we go. We'd love to hear from you. Please reach us on our Facebook at True North Eager Beaver, our Twitter feed at True Eager, or by email, truenortheagerbeaver@gmail.com. We read everything. And if you'd like to have something fresh from us as soon as it's right off the bandwidth, well, if you subscribe at our podpage.com/the True North Eager Beaver, all lowercase letters with a hyphen between each one of those words, well, we'll come to you as soon as we're ready. And why not subscribe to our True North Eager Beaver Media Incorporated YouTube channel? Yes, we are captains of industry now. That helps us out big time. Smash that button, as Kitty Lane always says. And if you're not listening on YouTube, if you could just use those lovely digits on your fingers to type that address in and subscribe, well, that helps us a lot because we're looking to get to at least 1,000.
I'll put myself over here and I'll just show the subscription. Whoop, that's right about there. There's the little button on the YouTube screen. If you want to click that, that'd be wonderful. We'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, do a little. We have to do some heavy lifting, so many hands make light work. There you go. We can't do this without you or your kind and generous support. So if you feel that we've done a really good show here, please go to our coffee page. You can scan that little doodad right above Mr. Grizzly's finger there with your phone if you're watching. Or if you're listening, you go to ko-fi.com/eagerbeaver, lowercase letters, and that's where you will find our emergency hot chocolate coffee Guinness Caesar Farm Boy gluten-free chocolate chip ice cream cookie fund.
Potato water party.
Oh yes, potato water party fund. Yes, please. We don't have
That's what potato water is. Vodka.
We don't have the rights to put Sarah McLachlan in the background asking, for you to make a donation, but just hear her sing and make a little donation to us.
Will
just
you
imagine my sad eyes.
remember me?
For $2 a day, you can support a beaver. Okay. Anyway, and finally, merch is coming soon, we promise. From the Beaver Lodge, this is your Eager Beaver saying, until next time, dear kids, it can be a tough world out there, so please be kind to and gentle with yourself. Also, make a plan to vote, and make a plan to vote with people who maybe didn't vote last time, because remember, friends don't let friends vote alone. All right. Now, before we go, we usually ask Mr. Grizzly for his words of wisdom. But since we have a guest here, first of all, thank you for your time. We appreciate it. We hope we get to see you again on the 29th for our results show. And do you have words of wisdom for the kids?
No, I just vote who you think will benefit you the most. Don't just vote for the party you voted for your entire life and your father and mother voted for and so on. Be informed. Be an informed voter.
All right. And Mr. Grizzly, your words of wisdom, please.
I'm tired and hungry, and this migraine is getting brutal. I need to go lie down.
All right.
That's my words of wisdom.
All right. Part of the be kind to and gentle with yourself. All right, Mr. Grizzly, please roll the credits. And thank you so much, Craig.
Thank you.
You are listening to a True North Eager Beaver media podcast. The True North Eager Beaver podcasts are proudly brought to you by our founding sponsors, the Miss V Mysteries from Corvid Moon Publishing, your source for science fiction, fantasy, and cozy mysteries featuring a broad diversity of characters. CanadianTarot.com, your uniquely Canadian online eclectic tarot community and forum, and The Peppermaster, hot pepper sauces made from fresh farm ingredients to thrill your taste buds and expand your mind. Hey there. And just a little programming note, Nick, tomorrow, Kits, we'll have something for you again with Nate Pike of the Breakdown Alberta, and hopefully the boys from Alberta Stan as well. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a beaverific weekend.
Oops, I pressed the wrong button. I'm tired.